A Short History of Nearly Everything by Bill Bryson. A sleepy summary. So imagine you're lying down somewhere very comfortable, maybe a big soft bed with too many pillows, and someone is going to tell you about absolutely everything that has ever happened in the entire universe. From the very first moment there was anything at all the way up to right now, this exact moment, and they are going to do it in the gentlest, most meandering way, pausing sometimes to look out the window at nothing in particular, drifting into little tangents about scientists who are grumpy or brilliant or both at the same time, and the whole thing is going to feel less like a lecture and more like someone sitting beside you in the dark, just quietly marveling at how strange and unlikely and beautiful it is that any of this exists at all, that you exist at all, that there are atoms in your body that were once part of stars, and that those stars are long gone and somehow here you are. Warm and breathing and maybe getting just a little bit sleepy already, which is fine, which is exactly right, because that's kind of how the universe itself began. Not with a bang that was loud in the way we usually think of loud, because there was no air yet, no medium for sound to travel through, no ears to hear it, just a sudden swelling expansion of everything from something so impossibly small and dense that our brains, lovely and capable as they are, simply cannot picture it. And you don't have to picture it, you can just let it wash over you, the idea of it, the sheer improbable fact of it. In the beginning, and we say beginning loosely because time itself only started when things started, there was this singularity, this one incomprehensibly tiny and hot point of everything, and then it expanded. And when we say expanded, we don't mean like a balloon inflating in a room, we mean space itself was getting bigger, the fabric of existence stretching outward in every direction at once. And within the first second, the very first second, already the universe was enormous. Already matter was forming, protons and neutrons and electrons, and then cooling, very gradually cooling over hundreds of thousands of years, and eventually hydrogen, just simple hydrogen, the simplest possible thing, and then gravity doing what gravity does, which is to pull things together with a patient and irresistible insistence, drawing hydrogen into clouds and those clouds into denser clouds, and eventually into the first stars, big stars, huge stars. Stars so much larger than our own sun that they burned brilliant and fast and then exploded. And in those explosions, in those supernovae, the heavier elements were forged, carbon and oxygen and iron and all the rest. Everything on the periodic table above hydrogen and helium was cooked up in a dying star and then scattered into space. And this is the part that makes you feel something if you let it, because those scattered atoms eventually found each other again, gravity again, always gravity, pulling things together, and some of those atoms ended up in another cloud, another slowly collapsing cloud that became our solar system, that became our sun, that became the rocky debris orbiting our sun, that became Earth, and eventually, improbably, tenderly, some of those atoms became you. Our sun is not particularly special, which sounds a bit insulting, but is actually quite reassuring. It is a medium-sized star of a very common variety, one of perhaps 200 billion stars just in our own galaxy, and our galaxy is one of perhaps 2 trillion galaxies in the observable universe. And the observable universe is just the part we can see, the part whose light has had time to reach us in the 13.8 billion years since everything began, and beyond that. Who knows, perhaps more of the same, perhaps forever more of the same, and all of this is happening simultaneously. Stars being born and dying, black holes consuming light, galaxies colliding in slow motion over millions of years. All of it right now, while you are lying there being wonderfully and specifically you on this one small wet blue planet, that as far as we know, is the only place in all that vastness where anything has ever stopped to notice any of it. And our planet, oh our lovely planet, it began hot, very, very hot, a molten ball of rock being constantly pelted by debris left over from the formation of the solar system, asteroids and comets crashing into it and melting into it and adding to it. And for a long time things were pretty chaotic. And then something very large hit the early Earth, a Mars-sized body called Theia, and this collision was so enormous that a great plume of debris was thrown into orbit around Earth. And that debris eventually coalesced into the moon, our beautiful patient moon. And the moon is important. The moon stabilizes Earth's axial tilt. It keeps our seasons regular and our climate from veering into wild extremes. And without it, perhaps life would never have gotten comfortable enough to really take hold. So in a way we owe our existence to a catastrophic planetary collision billions of years ago. Which is the sort of thing that sounds terrible, but turned out quite nicely. The Earth settled down over time, the surface cooled, water appeared, and we're not entirely sure where all the water came from. Some of it may have arrived on comets, some may have been released from the rocks themselves, but water came and oceans formed, and somewhere in those early oceans, or perhaps in a warm little pond, or perhaps in the deep-sea hydrothermal vents where hot mineral-rich water bubbles up from inside the Earth, somewhere in there, chemistry became biology. Molecules began making copies of themselves, and this was the most important thing that has ever happened. This was the beginning of life, and it happened remarkably quickly in geological terms, only a few 100 million years after Earth cooled enough for liquid water to exist, which is either encouragingly fast or terrifyingly fast, depending on how you look at it. For a very, very, very long time, life on Earth was just single-celled organisms, just tiny single cells living in the ocean, doing the basic work of living, eating and reproducing, and occasionally mutating, changing, becoming slightly different versions of themselves over thousands of generations. And this went on for billions of years, billions. And if you think about the entire history of life on Earth compressed into 1 year. Complex multicellular life doesn't show up until mid-November, and humans don't appear until about 11:30 on December 31st. And everything you have ever read about in a history book happened in the last few seconds before midnight, which is either humbling or absurd or both. And either way, it's a good thing to think about when you're trying to fall asleep, because it puts your Tuesday in a very comfortable perspective. The atmosphere of early Earth was completely different from what it is today, full of methane and carbon dioxide and ammonia, no free oxygen, nothing you could breathe. And then the cyanobacteria came along, those remarkable tiny organisms that figured out how to do photosynthesis, how to take sunlight and carbon dioxide and turn it into energy with oxygen as a byproduct. And they just kept doing this filling the atmosphere with oxygen. And this was actually a catastrophe for the life that existed at the time, which couldn't use oxygen and was poisoned by it. So most of the life on Earth died. The Great Oxidation Event, the most significant pollution event in the history of the planet, caused by the very organisms that made all future complex life possible, and the oxygen they produced accumulated in the atmosphere, formed the ozone layer, and created the conditions for everything that was to come. Somewhere along the way, one cell swallowed another cell, or perhaps was invaded by it, and instead of digesting it, the two cells developed a partnership, and the inner cell became what we now call mitochondria, the little power generators inside our cells, and all complex life on Earth, everything with cells that have a nucleus, is descended from that one ancient moment of unlikely cooperation. You and mushrooms and oak trees and octopuses and pandas. All of you sharing this ancient bacterial inheritance. All of you running on the same basic cellular machinery that was cobbled together billions of years ago in some ancient sea. Multicellular life eventually developed, and then the Cambrian explosion, that remarkable flowering of body plans around 540 million years ago, when suddenly the fossil record fills up with creatures of every imaginable shape and configuration, creatures with eyes and legs and shells and spines, and it is as if nature was trying everything at once to see what worked, and most of it was eventually set aside. Most of those early experiments in living didn't lead anywhere. But a few of them did. A few of those body plans persisted and adapted and gave rise to everything alive today. There were 5 great mass extinctions, perhaps 6 if you count what is happening right now, and each one ended the majority of species on Earth and allowed the survivors to diversify into the emptied niches and give rise to new forms of life. And the most famous extinction, the 166 million years ago that ended the non-avian dinosaurs, was caused by an asteroid roughly 10 kilometers across that struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico with a force so enormous that it's almost impossible to describe meaningfully. And the immediate aftermath was fire and then darkness, dust and debris in the atmosphere blocking sunlight, temperatures plummeting, the food chains collapsing. And this went on for years, and most large animals died, but small warm-blooded mammals in burrows survived, eating whatever they could find. And when the skies eventually cleared, and the world was warm again, they were still there, and they began to spread and diversify, and among them eventually were the primates, and among the primates eventually were the great apes, and among the great apes eventually were the hominins, and among the hominins eventually were us. Human evolution is a wonderfully complicated story, full of dead ends and branchings and revisions, and the more fossils that are found, the more complicated it becomes, which is as it should be because biology is complicated, and life doesn't follow simple straight lines. And what we know is that our ancestors diverged from the ancestors of chimpanzees somewhere between 6 and 8 million years ago in Africa. And for a very long time, there were multiple hominin species living at the same time. Different kinds of humanish creatures, and we are the only ones still here, and it is still a matter of some debate what exactly happened to all the others, though it seems we were not always kind to our cousins, and there is evidence of interbreeding with at least the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, which means that many people today carry a small percentage of DNA from these other human lineages, which is a nice thing to know, a nice thing to carry around with you. Our species, Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, appeared perhaps 300,000 years ago, but behaviorally modern humans, humans making art and using complex language and thinking abstractly, those seem to appear more recently, around 50 to 100,000 years ago, and then we spread out of Africa into Europe and Asia, and eventually across land bridges into the Americas, and across open water to Australia, and we were remarkably successful. And everywhere we went, the large animals tended to go extinct. The mammoths and the mastodons and the giant sloths and the moas, probably not entirely our fault, but we certainly didn't help. And we covered the earth, and we multiplied, and we began to change the landscape with agriculture about 10,000 years ago, and then more dramatically with the Industrial Revolution a few centuries ago, and now here we are, 8 billion of us, the most numerous large mammal that has ever existed, doing things to this planet at a speed that makes geologists very nervous. But we are also the creatures that looked up and wondered, that asked where they came from and tried to find out. And this is what this book is really about. This is the story Bill Bryson is telling, the story of how human beings, using only their minds and their instruments and their stubbornness, figured out the age of the universe and the size of atoms and the structure of DNA and the history of life on Earth. And the people who did this figuring were often eccentric, often ignored, often in conflict with each other, often wrong at first, sometimes wrong for a very long time, and the process of science is messy and human, and sometimes petty and occasionally brilliant, and the results are nothing short of miraculous. Take geology, the reading of the rocks, the attempt to understand what the Earth has been through and how long it took. For a very long time, people assumed the Earth was quite young, a few thousand years, because that seemed like enough time for things to happen. But then people started looking carefully at rocks and noticing things, noticing how long it takes for sediment to accumulate, how deep the layers are, how much has to have happened to get from ancient ocean floor to present mountain peak. And the time scales kept expanding. Thousands of years became millions, became hundreds of millions. And eventually, the true age of the Earth was revealed to be about 4.5 billion years, which required entirely new instruments to measure, radiometric dating, using the predictable decay of radioactive elements as a clock. And this is one of those beautiful things where physics and geology intersect, where an understanding of how atoms behave allows us to read the history of the planet in the rocks themselves. The story of how we figured out that continents move is a particularly good one for falling asleep to, because it happened slowly and was resisted for a long time. Alfred Wegener noticed in the early 20th century that the continents looked like they fit together, that South America and Africa seemed made for each other, and he proposed that they had once been joined, that the continents drift, and he was largely laughed at because no one could explain the mechanism. How could something as enormous as a continent move? And Wegener spent the rest of his life being dismissed, and he died on an expedition to Greenland in 1930. Before the evidence that would vindicate him was found, and the evidence came from the ocean floor, from the mid-ocean ridges where new seafloor is constantly being created, pushing the older seafloor aside, and the magnetic signatures frozen in the rocks as they cooled showed a beautiful symmetry, stripes of alternating magnetic orientation spreading out from the ridges on both sides, a record of the reversals of Earth's magnetic field preserved in stone, and suddenly everything made sense. The continents sit on tectonic plates that are being pushed and pulled by the slow convection of the mantle beneath them, and they have been doing this for billions of years, and the geography of the world is just where those plates happen to be right now, and in another few 100 million years it will look entirely different. The discovery of plate tectonics explained so much: why earthquakes and volcanoes cluster at certain places, why the Himalayas are so high and young, because the Indian subcontinent is still slowly crashing into Asia, why there are fossils of marine creatures on mountaintops, because those mountains were once ocean floor, and it connected everything. It made Earth a dynamic living system rather than a static backdrop, and it was only figured out in the 1960s and 1970s, which is quite recent, which is a reminder that even very large and fundamental things can be discovered quite late. The story of how we figured out atoms is a lovely, long, gentle story that spans centuries. The idea that matter is made of tiny indivisible particles is ancient. The Greek philosopher Democritus suggested it, but it was just a philosophical idea, not testable, not measurable, just a way of thinking about the world, and it sat there for 2,000 years while other things happened. And then in the early 19th century, John Dalton, an English chemist, began measuring chemical reactions and noticed that elements always combined in fixed ratios. That if you make water, you always need exactly twice as many hydrogen atoms as oxygen atoms. And from this, he inferred the reality of atoms, not just as a philosophical notion, but as an actual physical fact, and chemistry began to make sense. And then over the following century, more and more was learned about atoms, and the periodic table was organized, and it was realized that elements could be grouped by their properties, and that there were patterns, and Mendeleev, who made the great periodic table, famously left gaps in it where he predicted undiscovered elements must exist, and they were later found exactly where he said they would be. Then atoms turned out not to be indivisible after all. There was the electron, discovered by J.J. Thomson in 1897, and then Rutherford's famous gold foil experiment in 1911, where alpha particles were shot at gold foil and most went straight through, but a few bounced back. And from this, it was concluded that the atom is mostly empty space with a tiny dense nucleus in the center, and this was deeply surprising. Because if atoms are mostly empty space, then so is everything made of atoms, and the chair you are sitting in and the body you inhabit are mostly nothing, which is one of those facts that your brain accepts intellectually while refusing to fully believe. And then there was the quantum revolution, the realization that at the scale of atoms, the rules of physics are completely different, that particles don't have definite positions or velocities until you measure them, that light behaves as both a wave and a particle, that the universe at its smallest scale is fundamentally uncertain, and this disturbed Einstein greatly. He famously said God does not play dice with the universe, but the evidence kept coming in that actually the universe plays dice with itself constantly, and quantum mechanics is the most precisely tested theory in the history of science, accurate to 10 or more decimal places, and nobody entirely understands it. Niels Bohr said that if you are not shocked by quantum mechanics, you have not understood it. And Richard Feynman said nobody understands quantum mechanics, meaning not that it's wrong, but that it defies any intuitive picture. It is a mathematical description of reality that works perfectly and corresponds to nothing we can visualize. The story of how we figured out the scale of the universe is also wonderful and involves a lot of patience and ingenuity. For a long time, people didn't know how far away anything was, not even the other planets. And then in 1716, Edmund Halley, he of the comet, proposed that if observers at different latitudes watched Venus cross the face of the sun, the small parallax difference in their observations could be used to calculate the distance from Earth to Venus, and from that the distance to the sun itself. And this was tried with great international cooperation in the transits of Venus in 1761 and 1769, and the results were close to the true value, and having the distance to the sun allowed the distances to all the planets to be calculated from Kepler's laws, and astronomy suddenly had a ruler. But the stars were much farther away, and measuring their distances required different methods, parallax again, but now looking at the tiny apparent shift of nearby stars against the background of distant stars as Earth moves around the sun, and then for the more distant stars that were too far for parallax, the brightness methods, comparing how bright a star appears with how bright it actually is, and Henrietta Swan Leavitt, a human computer at the Harvard Observatory who was paid 25 cents an hour to catalog stars, discovered that certain variable stars called Cepheids have a regular relationship between their period of brightening and dimming and their true luminosity, and this gave astronomy a standard candle, a way to measure distances across enormous reaches of space. And it was this method that Edwin Hubble used to show that the fuzzy nebulae that had been debated for years were actually separate galaxies, separate island universes of hundreds of billions of stars each, and the universe became unimaginably larger overnight. And then Hubble noticed that the galaxies were moving away from us, almost all of them, and the farther they were, the faster they were receding, and this meant the universe was expanding, and running the expansion backward in time led inevitably to the conclusion that everything was once much closer together, was once all in one place, the Big Bang, which is not a very good name because it was neither big in the way we usually mean nor a bang. It was the expansion of space-time itself from an initial singularity, but the name stuck, as names do. The size of the universe as we currently understand it is something like 93 billion light-years across, which is the observable universe, the part we can see, and a light-year is the distance light travels in a year, about 9.5 trillion kilometers. So you can do the math, or you can just appreciate that these are numbers that our minds use rather than truly comprehend. placeholder magnitudes that we write down and work with, and which bear no relationship to anything we have ever experienced directly. And yet, we can measure these things, we can calculate them, we can test our predictions against observations and find them confirmed. And this is what Bryson finds so remarkable and what makes his book so warm and alive. Not just the facts, but the human beings who found them, working often in obscurity, sometimes in poverty, frequently in conflict with the accepted wisdom, persevering because they were curious, because they needed to know. Because the universe had this tantalizing quality of being comprehensible, of revealing itself to patient and careful inquiry. Consider Charles Darwin, who spent years collecting barnacles before writing on the origin of species, and who was terribly nervous about publishing it, knowing how controversial it would be, and who was scooped nearly into simultaneous publication by Alfred Russel Wallace, who had arrived at the same idea independently while ill with fever in the Malay archipelago. And the two were presented together to the Linnean Society in London in 1858, and the subsequent reaction was not a thunderclap of immediate recognition, but a kind of polite puzzlement. And then Darwin published his book in 1859, and then there was the thunderclap, and the world began slowly to change its understanding of what life is, and where it came from, and what relationship all living things have to one another. And this was perhaps the most important idea in the history of biology. Evolution by natural selection is elegantly simple. Organisms produce more offspring than can survive. Those offspring vary slightly from each other. Those variations that help survival and reproduction are more likely to be passed on. And over time, the population changes, and over long enough time, it changes enough to become something new. And given the 4 billion years that life has had to work with, the extraordinary diversity of life on Earth is not surprising at all, but rather inevitable. And the evidence for it is now overwhelming. In the fossil record, in comparative anatomy, in the biochemical similarity of all life, and most recently and conclusively in the sequences of DNA, which show the family tree of life written in the 4-letter alphabet of adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. Speaking of DNA, the discovery of its structure in 1953 by Watson and Crick, using X-ray crystallography data from Rosalind Franklin, data that was shared with Watson without Franklin's knowledge or permission, in a way that has troubled the history of the discovery ever since, was another of those moments when everything clicks into place, when a structure is revealed that immediately explains so much, because the double helix. The two strands wound around each other with complementary base pairs immediately suggests how DNA copies itself, how it stores information, how it can both be faithfully reproduced and occasionally mutated, and the entire machinery of molecular biology flows from this structure: the reading of the genetic code, the synthesis of proteins, the regulation of gene expression. The extraordinary complexity of a living cell that is still being understood and will be being understood for a long time to come. The human genome, all 3 billion base pairs of it, was sequenced in the Human Genome Project completed in 2003, And among the things discovered was that we have far fewer genes than expected, around 20,000, not much more than a fruit fly, and that large portions of the genome consist of what was initially called junk DNA, sequences that don't code for proteins, though it is becoming clear that much of this so-called junk is actually regulatory, controlling when and how genes are expressed, and the genome is less a parts list than an orchestral score, and we are only beginning to learn how to read the music. The story of how we learned to read rocks, to understand what they are and how they form and what they tell us about the past, is one of the quiet pleasures of Bryson's book. Rocks that form from cooling lava tell a different story than rocks that form from compressed sediment, which tell a different story than rocks that form under pressure deep in the earth and are pushed to the surface by tectonic forces. And learning to read these stories required centuries of patient observation. And the people who did it, the geologists, spent their time walking across landscapes with hammers, chipping at outcrops, collecting samples, building up a picture piece by piece. And the picture they built tells the long, strange history of this planet, the supercontinents that formed and broke apart and formed again, the oceans that opened and closed, the ice ages that came and went, the ancient atmospheres so different from today's. And speaking of ice ages, there were many, many of them, going back billions of years, and the most severe were the snowball Earth episodes, periods when glaciers may have covered the entire planet all the way to the equator, the oceans frozen over, temperatures plunging, and the only life surviving perhaps in small volcanic warm spots or deep ocean vents. And then the planet somehow warmed again, possibly through the buildup of carbon dioxide from volcanoes over millions of years with no weathering to absorb it. And the ice melted and life spread again, and here we are. And it is remarkable, the resilience of life, the tenacity with which it holds on and spreads into every available niche. The atmosphere itself has a history, a long, complicated history of being first created by volcanic outgassing, and then transformed by life, and then continually modified by living organisms and geological processes. And the current atmosphere, this thin shell of gas just barely held to the planet by gravity, this oxygen-nitrogen mixture that is so precisely suited to the life living in it that it can hardly be coincidence, except that it is not coincidence. It is the product of billions of years of organisms transforming their own environment and adapting to that transformation. And it is fragile, thin as the skin on an apple, Bryson says, and we are changing it at a rate that has no precedent in the geological record, except in moments of mass extinction. The chemistry of life is carbon chemistry, organic chemistry, and this is not a coincidence. Carbon is uniquely suited to building complex molecules. It can form 4 stable bonds with other atoms simultaneously. It can chain with other carbon atoms into long strings and rings and branching structures of enormous complexity. And all the molecules of life, the proteins and nucleic acids and lipids and carbohydrates, are carbon-based. And this is why we look for carbon-based life elsewhere in the universe, though we cannot be certain that other forms of chemistry might not support some other form of life, very different from anything we know. The question of life elsewhere in the universe is one Bryson touches on with characteristic lightness, noting that given the vast number of stars and planets and the apparent ease with which life arose on Earth, it seems very unlikely that we are alone, but noting also that we have no evidence yet of life elsewhere, not a signal, not a fossil, not a strange chemistry, nothing, and this silence is itself a puzzle, the Fermi paradox. Why, if there is so much potential for life out there, do we not see any sign of it? And the answers range from we haven't looked enough to life is very rare despite the apparent odds to complex intelligent life tends to destroy itself before spreading beyond its home world, which is not a comfortable thought, but not an easily dismissible one either. But let us not end there. Let us drift back to the small and the close, to the wonderful strangeness of the everyday world that Bryson so lovingly describes. The air around you is full of bacteria and fungal spores and viruses and dust mites, not to frighten you, but just to note that you are surrounded always by a vast invisible biosphere, and your own body is an ecosystem, 10 to 100 trillion human cells, but perhaps as many or more bacterial cells, living on your skin and in your gut and contributing to your health in ways we are only beginning to understand. And you are in some sense a community rather than an individual. A walking partnership of organisms that has worked out over millions of years. And the bacteria in your gut synthesize vitamins you could not live without and help digest food you could not process alone and educate your immune system as to what is a threat and what is not. The soil beneath your feet, if you are somewhere with good soil, is similarly alive, full of fungi and bacteria and earthworms and nematodes and creatures too small to see, and a single teaspoon of good forest soil contains more microbes than there are humans on Earth. And these tiny organisms do the work of breaking down dead matter and releasing nutrients and building the soil structure that allows plants to grow and hold water. And modern agriculture, with its pesticides and herbicides and heavy machinery, is not always kind to this invisible community. And this matters because the soil is the basis of the food chain that feeds us all. Water is an extraordinary molecule, 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen, nothing fancy, and yet it has properties so unusual that life, as we know it, would be impossible without them. It is one of the very few substances that is less dense as a solid than as a liquid, which is why ice floats. And this matters enormously because if ice sank, oceans would freeze from the bottom up and stay frozen and the world would be permanently glaciated. But instead, ice floats and insulates the water beneath it, and life survives the winter under the ice. And water has an unusually high surface tension and capillary action that allows it to move up through the vessels of plants against gravity. And it has an enormous capacity to store heat, moderating temperatures near large bodies of water, and it is the great solvent, dissolving more substances than any other liquid, which is why it can carry the nutrients that organisms need and why the chemistry of life happens in an aqueous medium. Light is also remarkable, and we know more about it now than anyone did a century ago, and still it surprises us. Maxwell showed in the 19th century that light is an electromagnetic wave, a coupled oscillation of electric and magnetic fields propagating through space at a constant speed. And this constant speed, this speed of light, turns out to be built into the fabric of space-time, a fundamental constant of nature. And when Einstein thought about what it would mean for the speed of light to be constant for all observers, he derived special relativity and all its strange consequences. Time dilation and length contraction, and the equivalence of mass and energy, E equals mc squared, that most famous and compact equation, which tells you that mass is a form of stored energy and that a tiny amount of mass corresponds to an enormous amount of energy, which is the principle behind both nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And it all followed from the single experimental result that the speed of light is always the same regardless of the motion of the observer. The story of the discovery of the speed of light itself is a nice small story. Old Roma in the 17th century noticed that the timing of the eclipses of Jupiter's moons depended on where Earth was in its orbit. They came early when Earth was on the near side of the Sun and late when on the far side, and he correctly attributed this to the finite travel time of light, and made the first estimate of the speed of light that was in the right ballpark, and this from astronomical observations of a moon of Jupiter, which is the kind of circuitous path by which knowledge often arrives. Nuclear physics, the study of the nucleus, gave us not only the bomb and nuclear power, but also the understanding of how stars shine, how they generate energy by fusing hydrogen into helium and releasing enormous amounts of energy in the process. And this led to the understanding of stellar evolution, how stars are born and how they die, how the sun will eventually exhaust its hydrogen and swell into a red giant, and eventually shed its outer layers as a planetary nebula and leave behind a white dwarf, a cooling cinder of carbon and oxygen about the size of the Earth, which will slowly cool over trillions of years, and nothing else exciting will happen to it. But this is billions of years from now, and there is no need to worry about it tonight. The story of how scientists figured out what the sun is made of is a particularly sweet one. For a long time, it was assumed that the sun, being so hot, would have burned away the lighter elements and consist mostly of heavy metals, iron perhaps. But Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin in her 1925 doctoral thesis analyzed the spectrum of the sun and concluded from the absorption lines that it consisted overwhelmingly of hydrogen and helium, and her advisor pressured her to add a note saying the result was probably spurious because it contradicted accepted wisdom. And she added the note, and a few years later it was confirmed that she was right and the accepted wisdom was wrong, and hydrogen and helium are indeed the overwhelming constituents of the sun and of the universe as a whole. And Payne-Gaposchkin eventually received the recognition she deserved, though not until much later than she should have. There is a recurring pattern in the history of science of women doing fundamental work and receiving insufficient credit. Franklin's X-ray crystallography used by Watson and Crick, Leavitt's discovery of the Cepheid period luminosity relationship used to measure the universe, Jocelyn Bell's discovery of pulsars, for which her supervisor received the Nobel Prize. And Bryson notes these cases with appropriate regret and uses them to remind us that science is done by human beings with all the biases and failings that implies, and that the history of science is not just a triumphant march of ideas, but a complicated human story. What is an atom, really, if you want to think about it as you drift towards sleep? An atom is a nucleus of protons and neutrons surrounded by electrons, and the electrons don't orbit the nucleus like planets orbit the sun. That is an approximation that helps beginners visualize, but is not quite right. The electrons exist as probability clouds, as standing waves around the nucleus, and they can only be in certain allowed energy states. And when an electron jumps from a higher energy state to a lower one, it emits a photon of light with a frequency corresponding exactly to the energy difference. And this is why each element emits and absorbs light at its own characteristic set of wavelengths, its own spectrum, and these spectra are the fingerprints of the elements, and they can be seen in the light from distant stars. And from those spectral fingerprints, we know what distant stars are made of without ever visiting them. And we know that the universe is made of the same stuff everywhere, the same atoms obeying the same quantum rules, which is reassuring in its way. The universe has a consistent vocabulary. The forces of nature, as we currently understand them, are four: gravity, which shapes the large-scale structure of the universe; electromagnetism, which governs chemistry and light and most of what we experience in daily life; the strong nuclear force, which holds atomic nuclei together against the repulsion of positively charged protons; and the weak nuclear force, which governs certain kinds of radioactive decay. Three of these four forces, all except gravity, have been unified in the standard model of particle physics, described by quantum field theory, and the standard model is extraordinarily successful, predicting the results of experiments at particle accelerators to tremendous precision. But gravity refuses to be incorporated. General relativity and quantum mechanics are both spectacularly successful in their own domains and completely incompatible with each other. And the search for a theory of quantum gravity, a theory of everything, has been the great unfinished project of physics for decades. And perhaps the most honest thing to say about it is that we don't know yet. String theory and its descendants propose that the fundamental entities are not point particles, but tiny one-dimensional strings whose different modes of vibration correspond to different particles. And this framework naturally includes gravity, but it requires extra dimensions curled up too small to detect. And so far it has made no predictions that can be tested. And there are physicists who believe it is the right track, and physicists who believe it is an elaborate and beautiful dead end, and the truth is not known. Dark matter and dark energy are two of the larger puzzles. The stars and gas we can see make up only about 5% of the total energy content of the universe. About 27% is dark matter, something that has mass and gravitational effects but doesn't interact with light, doesn't emit it or absorb it, and so is invisible, and we infer its existence from the way galaxies rotate and from gravitational lensing, light being bent around invisible masses, and we don't know what it is. And the remaining 68% is dark energy, something that is causing the expansion of the universe to accelerate, and we know even less about that. So when physicists describe the universe, they are describing 5% of it with great confidence, and the rest is mystery, which is a wonderful state of affairs, which means there is still so much to find out. The climate of Earth has changed enormously over its history, and understanding past climates requires reading ice cores and marine sediments and tree rings and coral skeletons, and all the proxy records that encode past temperatures and atmospheric compositions. And the picture that emerges is of a planet that has been both much warmer and much colder than today, that has had polar ice caps and then had none, that has had oceans both rising and falling. And all of this happened slowly by human time scales, though quickly by geological ones. And what is happening now is happening faster, faster than almost anything in the geological record. And this is something that scientists have been trying to communicate with increasing urgency for decades. But Bill Bryson is not primarily writing a cautionary tale. He is writing a love letter to science, to the enterprise of human curiosity, to the strange and wonderful fact that these large, clever apes on this small planet have looked around at the universe. They find themselves in and tried, with some success, to understand it. And the understanding is always incomplete and always provisional and always being revised and improved. And that is not a weakness but a strength. That is what makes science science rather than dogma, the willingness to change your mind when the evidence demands it, the commitment to following the evidence wherever it leads, even if it leads somewhere unexpected or uncomfortable. The things we know now that no one knew a century ago are astounding. We know the age of the universe and the age of the Earth. We know the structure of DNA and the mechanism of heredity. We know how stars form and how they die. We know what the continents are doing and why earthquakes happen where they happen. We know what happened in the first seconds of the universe. We know what the human genome looks like. We know that the universe is expanding and that the expansion is accelerating. We know that we share most of our DNA with other apes and a surprisingly large amount with yeast. We know that the floor of the ocean is being constantly created and destroyed. We know how species evolve and how they go extinct. We have, in a very rough and incomplete way, cracked the code of the universe, which is extraordinary, which is one of the most extraordinary things about being alive in this particular moment in history, and we are still learning. Every day new papers are published, new measurements are made, new observations come in from telescopes and particle accelerators and DNA sequencers and ocean sensors. And the picture gets a little clearer and a little more complicated simultaneously, and there is no end to it, which is not discouraging but exciting, which means that the adventure continues, which means that the people who come after us will have the pleasure of discovering things we cannot imagine. Bryson tells all of this with warmth and humor and a genuine sense of wonder, and he is transparent about his own limitations, acknowledging when things are complicated or contested or beyond his ability to explain clearly. And he interviews scientists and reads widely and visits places, the Burgess Shale and Yellowstone and the great observatories, and the book is grounded in these specific human encounters. These real conversations with real people who have devoted their lives to particular questions, and their enthusiasm comes through, their love of their subject, their willingness to spend years on something that most people have never heard of and may never care about. And it is this love, this curiosity, this willingness to ask why and then spend a lifetime figuring out the answer that Bryson is ultimately celebrating. We are, all of us, made of star stuff, as Carl Sagan said, as is true in the most literal possible sense. The iron in your blood was forged in a supernova, the calcium in your bones was made in a star, and the atoms that make up your body have been part of countless other things before they were you, and they will be part of countless other things after, and none of them know they are part of you, and you will not know what they become. And this is either melancholy or wonderful or both, and either way it is true. And knowing it changes how you feel about yourself and your brief time here, this brief, bright arrangement of atoms that thinks and feels and reads books about where it came from and why. So here we are, here you are. At the end of a very long, sleepy journey through nearly everything, from the Big Bang to the present moment, from quantum foam to continents, from the first self-replicating molecule to the creature reading this summary. This creature, who is an improbable outcome of 4 billion years of unplanned and uninstructed evolution on a medium-sized rocky planet orbiting an undistinguished star in the outer suburbs of one galaxy among trillions. A creature whose existence required every one of its ancestors to survive long enough to reproduce, going all the way back to single cells in a warm ancient sea. A creature who can look up and name the stars and look down and see the bones of extinct creatures in the rock, and look inward and understand something of the machinery of its own cells, and who can read a book and be astonished and delighted and a little humbled by the whole extraordinary, improbable, beautiful thing. Which is, all things considered, a very good way to be. In the end, this sleepy summary, with its warm light and relaxing tone, is not meant to replace something. It is meant to point toward a much larger light. It is offered with care and with the genuine hope that something in tonight's listening finds its way into you as an invitation. The whole book is waiting. The real depth lives there, in every word they chose and every story they told and every quiet idea they let breathe across a full page. Let this be the beginning of something you carry forward in the light of an ordinary tomorrow, and if this lamp has helped you in some way, a light keeps it burning for someone else who might need it too. Sleep well. You are made of stardust, and you deserve the rest.